Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I want to share with you some tips on how to improve your sight reading and what kind of resources you can use. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already done so, and make sure to check the notifications bell to never miss a new video. Also, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give us a like. So I would like to break down this video into three different parts. In the first one, I'm going to tell you what sight reading actually is. In the second part, I'm going to give you some tips on how to improve and practice your sight reading. And in the last section, I'm going to give you some suggestions on what books and resources you can use for sight reading. So what does the word sight reading mean? When we play anything on the piano, we have to learn it to be able to play it, right? There are two ways to learn something to play. The first thing is the easiest one is by ear. So you hear something and you work it out just by listening to it, or somebody shows it to you and you copy what their hands are doing. So this is kind of a visual audio memorizing process, and it doesn't involve any sheet music. The second and traditional and most common way of playing something on the piano is to learn it from sheet music. So you basically have printed music in front of you and you're going to read the notes and the rhythms, and by reading it, you are going to be able to play it. Now, this in itself is not sight reading as such, it just means you're reading music. In most of the cases, we won't be able to perform something just by reading it once, and that's why we practice. Now, sight reading is very similar to this, but it basically means that you have to play something the very first time you see it. So, for example, if I put this book in front of you and I ask you to play me these two lines, you have to play it the very first time you see it without any practice. And this is very difficult because your brain has to process so many things in such a short amount of time. And that's basically what sight reading is. It's the ability to play music at the very first sight. Now, let's see how we improve sight reading and what kind of techniques we can use to improve sight reading. Rule number one is sight reading is a process. You can't do it quickly. For example, if you are very bad at sight reading and you have an exam in 3 months' time and you have a sight reading test in it as well, you can't sit down 3 days before the exam, practice all day and expect to be very good at sight reading on the day. But if you have a piece that you sit down for 3 days and you play it night and day, there is a good chance that you'll be able to learn that piece even in the time of a week. But sight reading is very different. It's like reading a book. Remember the first time you started reading letters and numbers, it took a very long time to piece together a word from 6-7 different letters, and it was quite difficult to read an entire book. It took a lot more time than it takes now, because now when you read a book, you basically look at words and your eyes recognize certain shapes, and you don't have to read each letter individually, you just read shapes and patterns. And the same applies to music. So in the very beginning stages, you are going to be looking at individual notes and you have to learn which note is which and how long is each note. But as you become better and better at reading music, you have to recognize shapes and patterns, and that's how we become much faster and much better at sight reading. For example, reading by intervals is going to make you a much better sight reader than reading each individual note. To give you an example, have a look at this here. So the first few notes here follow a pattern. As you can see here, we've got steps because this note is on the line, the next note is in the next space, and the next note is on the next line. So there's nothing between them. They fill in each space and line after each other, and we call these intervals steps. Now here something happens. The first note is in the space and the next note is in the space as well, so the line is missing between the two notes, and we call this a skip because we're skipping the line. We go from space to space. If I know what the very first note is in this short little 2-bar phrase, I will be able to play all of these notes without actually knowing what they are. Because I'm going to play this first note, I know this is a G, and then I go down a step, down a step, down a step, and then up a skip. And this is what's called playing by intervals. And the more intervals you recognize by the shape of them, the easier it's going to be to follow a pattern or a sequence of notes without actually knowing what the notes are. Another thing that you can do to improve sight reading is recognize shapes or chords. When multiple notes are played at the same time, we call them chords, and these can have very specific shapes as well. In this example here, you can see a 3-note chord, and you can see that each note is in a space above each other, which means that there is a skip between each of these notes, and it's going to be a triad where one note is missing between each of these notes. And every time you see the shape from now on, you'll know how to put your hand in what kind of shape, and all you need to know is what the bottom note is, because the upper 2 notes are going to be just a skip away from each other. So this was tip number 1, to learn to read shapes, intervals, and patterns. The second thing that's very important when it comes to sight reading is to hold the rhythm very, very even and to make sure that you count. Many people, when they start sight reading, they manage to get the notes right, but the rhythm is completely gone. You speed up, you slow down, you think about the next note, you don't care about crotchets and quavers, everything, all the note values just become the same. Playing the correct note is only half the success. You also have to get the rhythm right. So when you start practicing and learning sight reading, you have to make sure that you count all the way through. Counting out loud is even better because it's much easier to carry on with a loud count than if you count in yourself. Tip number 3 is to do sight reading continuously and consistently. As I mentioned, sight reading is not something that you can do in a short, very intensive course. You can't become much better at sight reading in the period of 3 days or 1 week. If you spend 10 minutes every single day for 6 months on sight reading, is going to be much better than spending 1 month 2 hours every single day, because frequency is much better than quantity. So doing sight reading every single day is much better than doing a very long session once a week. Also, you have to remember that the concentration span decreases with time, so the longer you try to sight read, the less you can concentrate and your mind gets tired. So doing many shorter sessions is going to be a lot more effective and you can progress a lot faster. Tip number 4 is to not sight read things that are too difficult for you. The general rule is that you should sight read things that are 2 or 3 grades below your standard. So for example, if you're a grade 5 piano student, you should practice sight reading grade 3 or grade 2 songs. And that's because the difficulty that you play at grade 5 is too hard for you to sight read. If you are at a grade 5 level, you're much better off practicing a lot of grade 2 songs for sight reading instead of practicing a few grade 5 songs. Because the more new music you see, the better you become at sight reading. If you keep practicing the same difficult pieces and just a few of them, your sight reading is not going to improve because you end up practicing the piece instead of reading new music every single time. Once again, the most important thing is to play as much new music as you can and try to keep it simpler so you can do more of them instead of keeping them very difficult and do less of it. So let's see what kind of resources we can use for sight reading. If you're a very beginner, very early beginner, then you're probably following a method book such as Piano Adventures, Alfred's piano course, Hall Leonard. Most of these piano method books are going to have separate books for technique, for repertoire, and for sight reading and theory. So if you're doing one of these method series, feel free to use the sight reading book for each lesson book, because the good thing about them is that they are related to the actual lessons that you're doing in the lesson book, so you can nicely do them in bundles, and they are very progressive, so there's no danger for you to do something that's too hard for your level. For example, Piano Adventures has these sight reading books for every lesson book, and you've got lots of progressive exercises, and each of them is related to one of the lessons in the lesson book. So these are really good. They have a lot of practice in them, but they are not the only way to practice sight reading, and they are only suitable for the very beginning stages like under grade 1 and grade 1, possibly grade 2. If you are a late beginner or early intermediate student and you want to improve your sight reading or practice more sight reading, then my number 1 favorite choice is Paul Harris's Improve Your Sight Reading series. This series goes from grade 1 all the way to grade 8. but it's very, very structured. So all of these books have stages, and in each stage you've got one line exercises, and when you've done the first exercise you tick it and you go to the next one, and each stage is adding something in addition to the previous stage. So for example, in the first stage you've only got crotchets, in the next stage you've got crotchets and minims, in the next stage you've got skips and steps, in the next stage you add ties and slurs, in the next stage you add staccatos, in the next stage you add syncopation, in the next stage you add key signatures. So it's very, very well structured, and it doesn't put you into the deep water. You can practice everything little by little, and you can make sure that there are no gaps anywhere in your knowledge and skills. There are other versions similar to this Paul Harris series, and anything that's kind of progressive is very good for sight reading, because sometimes it's very difficult to decide what's suitable for your level if you play random songs from random books. But if you use these series, I think ABRSM has a similar one called Joining the Dots. I think that one goes from grade 1 to grade 8 as well, but my favorite one is by Paul Harris, Improve Your Sight Reading. If you're practicing for a piano exam, ABRSM, RCM, Trinity, then every piano exam has a sight reading test book for each level, for grade 1 to grade 8. And in these books, you basically have sight reading exercises that appear in the exams or have appeared in the exams before. So the same difficulty as you can expect in your piano exam. Now, these books are really good because, first of all, they give you a lot of practice, but they also kind of show you what to expect on the day of the exam. The books don't have too many exercises. This one only has 23, and I don't think that 23 exercises are enough to make you a good sight reader. So although it's a very good resource to have, it's not sufficient to become very good at sight reading unless you play a lot of other songs besides your exam songs. But I think ABRSM now has a second edition, which is more sight reading. So for each grade, you can have 2 books, which gives you twice as much to practice. But again, these ones are only good after grade 1. So if you are a very young beginner, under grade 1 or pre-grade 1, then you need to use one of the method book sight reading supplementary books. Now, if you are not doing any exams and you don't follow a method book, or maybe you are an intermediate student or an advanced student, then you can have a look at many songbooks or collections. So in this section, if you are around grade 1 to grade 5, you can have a look at the Bach Anna Magdalena book, which is a collection of Baroque songs, and they're very good for developing coordination between the two hands. You've got independent melodies in them, and they give you a lot of challenge when it comes to sight reading because it's not very predictable music. So that's anything by Bach, which is on the easier side, is very good for sight reading. You can also have a look at Bartók's For Children, which is in 2 volumes. And again, it's very interesting songs which are not very predictable. And when I say not very predictable, I mean that it's not just simple broken chords in the left hand. It's not 3-chord pieces like many of the Czerny exercises. They are really fun to play as well, but when it comes to sight reading, if it's very predictable, it's going to be very easy, and it's not going to improve you as much as something that's less predictable, where you have to actually read all the intervals or all the notes. Another such example would be Clementi sonatas, or any kind of easier sonatas, sonatinas by Mozart or Diabelli. You can have some easier sonata movement collections, which are around grade 2 to grade 4 or 5. Again, these are very fun pieces to go through. They are quite long, but easier to sight read than Bach, and it's very enjoyable music to play. And similarly to Bartók, you've also got Schumann's Album for the Young, or Tchaikovsky or Kabalevsky's albums. These are all great books in the range of grade 1 to grade 5. Just remember, when you pick songs to sight read, make sure that they are not your current standards. So if you are playing grade 5 pieces for your exam, don't try to sight read grade 5 level pieces unless your sight reading is really, really good. The pro of these books, trying to improve sight reading from songbooks, is that not only you practice sight reading, but you also come across a lot of pieces that you might not otherwise play or practice, and it's going to give you a lot more experience in different styles and genres, and you're going to play actual music. The con of these books is that they are not progressive and they don't focus on specific sight reading skills, it's actual pieces. So I think it's good to have a selection of both of these. So maybe have your improve your sight reading series, and also some songbooks or some of the ABRSM sight reading books, which again are kind of full pieces and give you different kind of challenges. And if you follow any of these series or books and you do it every single day, at least 10-15 minutes, you are going to see a big improvement in your sight reading. Of course, sight reading is not absolutely essential to be a good pianist. You can still practice your pieces, learn them with help, and become a great performer without being able to sight read very well. But sight reading is an amazing skill to have because you can learn so many new pieces without the need to listen to someone else play them or someone else help you learn them. So it just makes learning much quicker, and it also makes you more confident that what you play is actually correct because you can read it from the sheet music. So this was my video on sight reading, what sight reading is, how to practice it, and what kind of resources you can have a look at. I hope this was helpful to you, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, subscribe for more.